Welcome back to the Big Issue 97.3 City FM and also on City TV. My name is Godfred Akotobafu. We are discussing the absence of substantive MMDCEs across the country, whether it is affecting local governance or not. During this conversation with Neil Antivadapo, Member of Parliament for the Dodo, former local government minister, currently ranking member on the Local Government Committee of Parliament, Dr. Richard Fiadomo, Executive Director of CHALOC, that's the Chamber for Local Governance, and Bismarck Bezinkum, who is the President of the Association of Local Authorities of Ghana. So he's representing the affected persons in this conversation, and he says they are not affected. In fact, everything is going on smoothly. Franklin Kujo is also with us. Franklin, I'm sure you've heard all the affected parties so far. What are your thoughts?
It's been an entertaining conversation because the nature of our politics would mean that if the local government setup actually mattered a whole lot, we wouldn't even be having this conversation in the first place. You know, where we are trying to decentralize because we wanted to offload the burden on the center in terms of management, in terms of investment decisions, so that we don't splurge the money in Accra on civil servants. We seem not to have actually reached that destination yet, because what is holding that journey is essentially because we have a system where everyone appointed at the local level is beholden of the presidency. So maybe what I'm saying here maybe up for constitutional review, and I think the president himself has been quite categorical that some of the burden needs to be shifted away from him by making the position of the MMDCE elected.
Yeah, we tried that.
I'm sure he would blame the NDC.
He will blame you
yeah, but I think that is where I find this quite troubling. So in spite of the fact that SAL, where I come from, is not known to the country, and thanks to the current Honorable Minister for Local Government, who has done virtually nothing on this matter, it looks as if I'm just going to help the discourse because I'm supposed to be a co-citizen of Ghana, right?
Yes. So please do so.
Yeah, I'll do that. So for me, the conversation really is one about where the powers of the president towers above everything else. And if I see that, and I like to say that at the end of the day, the imagination, the innovation, the creativity that person so appointed would have in order to build the capabilities and indeed multiply the capabilities of local governments as in districts and municipalities, is actually held at bay, because everybody will be looking over his or her shoulders whether the president likes me or not, because that's essentially what I'm getting from the conversation as it goes. Because it appears that even though the president may only have to affirm whoever has been nominated through the district's level setup, the president still has the power to hire and fire at the end of the day. So it seems to me that the larger conversation in all of this is the fact that we seem not to have taken the consideration of the development of these districts or these municipalities into consideration. Question I have: if we have a local development economic plan or municipal economic plan, I think that should be more paramount than who actually occupies the position in terms of the appointment scenarios that we have right now. I would have thought that the conversation would have been, how do we narrow the gap between the amount of money we collect as taxes? What is the plan for the local income tax situation in the various districts or the various municipalities, for instance? So I'm looking at the bigger conversation, and I think, frankly, this conversation about not being appointed and when one will be appointed is frankly one of those that is detracting from the larger conversation about the productivity of these districts or the municipalities or otherwise. I mean, as a policy person, I tend to look at things within that broad framework, and I'm saying that local government is suffering because of the partisan political bickering that we have actually bestowed on ourselves. And until we have a proper reform agenda which takes away the appointing powers of the president and the high and firing powers of the president, unfortunately, these things will continue. Have you asked yourself? I mean, I heard Honorable Nilante saying that the minister for the regional minister in Accra is the one now going around more or less catering to the needs of sanitation, for instance. But the bigger question I have is, what has been the impact on the economy of these various decentralized units as we haven't had appointed DCEs or MMCEs? If we have been able to quantify that, then we would have seen that we have a real problem. But the question is, has there been an impact, maybe apart from sanitary duties? If these districts were well endowed and their productivity emanated from a grand plan that has been developed by these rather powerful assemblies, I don't think we would have been having this conversation about who has been appointed or whether there's been a lag in appointments. But the point really is that because there's been a lag in appointment, we don't see the necessary impact. Of course, maybe signed signatures, signing certificates may have been delayed, but the overall district, development agenda. Question is, if we had done an analysis to determine whether the delay in appointments has affected the overall district plan, as in the growth of the district or the municipalities, then we would have said, well, maybe the delay in appointments may actually be making a significant dent on the economies of these various decentralized units. So my conversation, my contribution to this conversation essentially is one of whether we have reached that desired end of the journey. The reasons why we have created decentralized units at all, I say we haven't. Precisely because of the political nature of the appointing processes. It makes it difficult for innovation, it makes it difficult for creativity, and it makes it difficult for the overall development of this district to be seen the way they are. Because why should anybody be looking over his or her shoulders before acting? And so these positions are basically held because these people who occupy these positions want to make the local party bosses happy and eventually look up to the center for some blessing. I don't think that's the way to go. So this will be
okay. Thank you, Frank. Let me come back to you, Honorable Nilante Vanderpoel. I guess you've heard what the responses have been, and I guess the next stage of this conversation becomes everybody's disappointment with our inability to vote for MMDCEs, which some say would have prevented the situation that you are complaining about. And as Franklin intimated, there are those who lay this at the doorstep of your party, that but for your party, we'll probably not be having this conversation right now. In fact, when the president spoke about this in Tamale, he again alluded to the fact that his vision was for this particular job not to be his, but it didn't happen.
Before Nilante comes in, I disagree on that particular posturing, that it was because the NDC got involved. Maybe the NDC made capital of the natural descent at the time. I think the president was affected, that particular issue was affected by the sentiments around the economy and the governance system of the country at the time. And so that's how he pulled out. I don't think he pulled out necessarily because of the NDC's posturing.
Well, let me say yes, I agree totally with Franklin on that. But it is also not true that, because if you look at the NDC has been the, let me say, the mothers of this particular issue. When we asked for the constitutional review, the committee report came in, that then came up. One of the recommendations was the election of MMDCEs. As to the mode of election, that has been the problem of almost everybody. So various scenarios were evolved as to how we're going to have. Some people thought that we should have an application. People should be free to apply to the Public Service Commission. Interviews should be conducted. 3 best people are thrown back to the public or the district for an election. That was it. In Parliament, when we started the discussion on this particular issue, the NDC all along were all good for elections. It was in our manifesto. It was an MPP manifesto. So we all agreed in principle, or the nation has agreed in principle, that MMDCEs, it was time for MMDCEs to be elected. But as to how the election should be conducted, what's the issue? The MPP had said that they want it to be hinged on our political structures we have. And we said no. We said yes, we want an election of them. So people like Franklin, like Godfred, should be free to apply to be a DCE in the particular district, irrespective of their political background. But don't ask the political parties to back people to be elected as MMDCEs. Before we felt that, look, the sort of politicization we have at the central level, if it should go down to our local level, it will further divide this country.
But they also said that was hypocritical because that already exists.
You see, existing in its face is different from acting it. Because I will have confidence to come to you at the district level with all my political exposure for discussion than to have somebody I know, let's say for example, my opponent in the elections, sitting there as an MMDCE, as the mayor of Accra. You think I will have the same disposition? No. That will be different from someone like Franklin or you sitting there. So we are saying that, look, fine. Once there's a tenure office, and all, there's a person may be an NDC or an MPP, but once the person goes there as an independent person, the person will have that distinct to be proactive to suggestions from everybody in the society. But once you make it a political distinct, it will further corrupt the system. Look, these so-called power brokers within the districts, the kingmakers within the districts, will take over the same way they take over with appointment, or let me say nomination of people to be parliamentary candidates. You know, there are people who are kingmakers in certain constituencies, and make sure they say they will get into this level too, and make sure that I'm putting you Akoto, I'm going to use the party structure which I control in this district to make you a DCE. All the contracts are mine. You understand? So we are saying that, look, let it be so open that we're going to have election. But this particular election, at this particular level, should not be politically based. It should not be political, so that we can have free people. Because the reason, one of the main reasons why we have 30% of the appointees coming from the president at that time was the fact that we agreed that the assembly may not have the requisite, professional qualifications in its structure. So the 30% was supposed to bring people on the district who have some qualifications, some, let me say, expertise to augment the capabilities of the elected assembly members in the discourse at assembly. But that was corrupted. That was politicized. Now you have so-called political appointees, party executives and things who are filling that 30%. So we are saying that if we further go that way, the whole structure of local governance will become political. So let's say, for example, in SAL, if SAL comes into operation, you understand? Today, some of the basic reasoning of SAL suffering this because it seems to be a biased NDC environment. So, in election, you elect a DCE who is not an NDC person, because the government can use its influence and say we want to have such a person as DCE. The person may be elected, but he will not get a cooperation from the people within the district. So that will further bring cracks in the governance at that level. It's the same thing. We argued and we saw that, look, it is better for you to have somebody who is confident that, look, the president cannot sack me. I have a security of tenure. I need not take political decisions in this district. That's what we're looking at. Than to have a person who is there as because of patronage, because he belongs to a political party, because he will sing the chorus of the party chairman in that particular district. That's what we wanted to avoid. So it is not because we didn't want the election of MMDCs. We didn't want election of MMDCs on partisan basis. That's to clear that out. But the truth of the matter, we've come to a level where we think that, let's sit down. If we think that we can have a model that could match the stand of the NDC and the stand of the MPP, we are all for it. But as at now, the basic difference is the fact that they want it to be political and we don't want it to be political. But let me touch on this issue. You see, I will want to see a situation whereby, like Frank said, proper decentralization is happening on the ground. What we have is basically transfer of responsibility and functions without fiscal transfer. So monies are handled at the central government and center. But when you go to places like Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and other places, they have even gone further with fiscal decentralization. In fact, a country like even Senegal here, they virtually learnt from our system. Professor Ho and the rest offered expertise. Are even going, they are even much more advanced than us today, because we fear to let the fiscal side of decentralization go.
To be innovative, really. I mean, let me not cut you. You see, we engaged the Lands Commission once, I think last year, and we found out that only 10% of lands in Accra are digitized. That means only 10% of lands in Accra, meaning the remainder of the country is not. Now, this is where the imagination of local government comes into being, because we are lamenting the paucity in the collection of local taxes, for instance.
IGF.
But there's a lot of property taxes that could be definitely collected if these local authorities were so empowered. So the fiscal decentralization is a critical matter that ought to be looked at carefully. You'd have thought that if the DCE or MMCE didn't need to look over his shoulders to be beholden of that pointer, then the person may have the leeway to be able to be quite innovative and ensuring that at least lands that are within his or her respective jurisdiction are properly assessed, valued, and property taxes are paid. That would help us narrow our deficit when it comes to the tax to GDP rates, which is currently at 14%, when our neighbors are doing almost 20%.
Frank has even gone too higher. Let me say, with issue about digitization of land. Let me tell you this. I went to a district on one of our local government committee tours, and IGF was very poor. And this is quite a huge district. Huge district. We were one of the biggest markets. Apart from the markets, they don't make any money from any other source. So I asked them, because when we went there was so much advert on the radio station about funeral, because it was a funeral week. You know, in some of these districts, they set a particular week in the month where they do all their funerals. So when we went to the funeral grounds, there were almost about 30 funerals that week. Thank you. When I asked the DCE, not a peswa from all these funerals, all the burials. So I asked them, do they make any money from the burial? He said, no. How are they going to make money? I said, don't you know we pay for burials in Accra? He said, here they don't pay anything. He said, the funerals, they don't pay anything. Yes. So when they finish, who clears the debris? So assembly, they don't pay anything. So that should tell you that you will need innovative thinkers to be able to manage the affairs in the districts. But once it continues to be political patronage, somebody has made a DCE because the father was a party chairman and the father died during the campaign through an accident. So as a compensation for the late father, he's been made a DCE. The person cannot read a letter that we have sent to him from the committee and we're coming there. He couldn't read and appreciate the contents of the letter.
In 2013, we did a study of some of those districts within the Dunkwa Onofin area, right? And I remember when we visited with the DCE and asked him what plans he had, potential plans he had to optimize the value of the Afram Plains area, for instance, he looked up to his district planning guy, and the guy said, well, I'm just an armchair planner here. I don't have any authority. I think a lot, but nothing happens. At that same time, there was a redemarcation of the districts. And you know Mami Krobo Market?
Yes, huge market.
Was responsible for 80% of the IGF of this existing district at the time. Yeah. When we asked the DC what his plans were, given that the district was going to be redemarcated.
So the market could go to another district?
He said his plan is to stay where the Mami Krobo Market is, so that he can be part of the... He can make sure that there's nothing, virtually nothing
to do on the other side.
But this is a front place, an area that is well endowed naturally, that could have been optimized if they were given the free rein to think.
So you see, I agree with my colleague, but you see, what is he going to say at this point in time? As we are talking about, he himself, the NALAC president, is not sure whether he will be reappointed or not.
I'm sure he's confident.
Well, quite positive.
No, is it? So,
are you confident or not?
You are not.
He seems like a great guy, by the
way. You don't expect him to agree with us, because that possibly could endanger his return. His return. You see, but the truth of the matter is, like the Sherlock executive said. You see, the reason why in the Constitution the tenure of an MMDCE is not cast in iron, that nobody can do anything, because of the power of the president to hire and fire at any time the DCE. So you could be appointed today, you could be sacked tomorrow. If the Constitution shall have a term of 4 years, you understand, why would the president have that luxury of hiring and firing? And if the president has the power of hiring and firing, that's what we are saying, is that the president has not done justice to us, you understand, as a people, by not reappointing those he thought had done well and firing those he thought had not done well the first term. You could have done that.
Isn't there an institute of local governments that normally assesses?
There is.
They did the ranking about a month ago, yes.
Okay.
And you see, through the local government service, performance contracts are signed these days. Performance assessments are done on all district assemblies. Through the district league table, you are even able to at least evaluate the districts that are doing well. And the district league table is an undertaking from a non-governmental institution, the UNDP. So it is not something that anybody will say you could. But I heard him talk about DDF. DDF, in order for assemblies to qualify for DDF, let me tell you, they always falsify figures. They indicate revenues that they've collected, when in actual fact they've not even collected even a quarter of those things. But you need to achieve certain indicators, let me say, indicators to be able to qualify for that money. But in order for them to get the revenue, they connive and falsify the figures to get that money. But the performance doesn't even measure up to those things. And so DDF is not something that we want to talk about. Real assessment of the assemblies could be from your own IGF, could be from, as Frank is saying, certain innovative policies and this and that, programs that you can embark upon within the district. If you have a district which hasn't got teachers, for example, for basic education, what did the assembly do within a year to be able to improve upon that? It's a simple thing that I can use to measure an assembly. You didn't have water. What did you do as a DC for 4 years? You didn't have toilets. What did you do for 4 years? These are basic things that the district league table, for example, look at. What's the security situation in the assembly? What policies and programs did the assembly embark upon to improve upon the security in the district? These are simple questions they ask. And this thing could be a standard for assessing whether somebody performed well or not. These are simple things. But if those things cannot still be a measure for us to measure the performance of an MMDCE, it has to take us 8 months to 9 months. We are getting to the 9th month. For us to say this person did well or not, then it becomes a problem for me.
And just to wrap this up, looking at the timelines given by Mr. Bismarck, even if it comes through, we are definitely looking at a confirmation process, say, sometime in November.
Or even next year.
Because he said the last time they did this, President approved by May and everything was by July. So let's say, well, we do this September, October, November.
If the list come out in September, it will take about, at least, by the law, at least about 14 days before the assemblies will be convened to try to pass them. You understand? In fact, it's clear. And if the president said they are building consensus, let me also tell you, it's true. And in certain areas, they know that if we consider what you say hypocritical stand, some of the assemblies
are heavily tilted in the opposite way.
So it's possible that even if you nominate people, they will not go through. You understand? But that is why it's important that those areas where we are sure of the performance of the MMDCs, we do it now. So that in case there are any, let me say, fallouts, we'll be able to have the time to address those fallouts before the end of the year. Because going into next year, where we have a situation whereby, as he himself said, we have 2020 fourth quarter common fund outstanding. There is nothing really going on in assemblies. It becomes difficult for the technical people within the district to work. Look, we just come back from a tour. We went to one of the newly created regions. They are virtually using the facilities of the then assembly as the regional coordinating office. The now regional director of health, there's no budget. So they have to fall on the budget, the common fund budget of the city MP. The city MP came up and said, no, you have no right to do that. I'm going to court. So we have to step in and say, look, it's all for the good of the district. You are the MP. Health delivery is important. What can we do to resolve this problem? But the DCE was lost. He couldn't do anything.
And he wrap up for me.
So I will plead that, you see, there are certain, let's put the issues of technicalities and law and all those aside and look at the basic issues impeding the development of the assemblies and see that if these even assemblies are suffering, as we have it today, the absence of leadership would definitely make or exacerbate the situations we have. Because there is no leadership now. And the earlier the president nominates people to take away the anxiety of even those who have been, yesterday a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, a former MP, has gone for an interview. A very professional person, very competent person. To me, he's the most competent of all the people who went for the interview.
He's sweating.
He's sweating. He said, I don't know my stand. This is somebody who I know, irrespective of, he was my opponent in an election. But I will vote for him 10 times to be the mayor. You understand? I'm not referring to Accra, I'm not referring to Kenya, I'm not referring to Kumasi. This is a situation whereby in Kumasi, for example, the current mayor said, in view of the politicking around, I'm no more interested. Assuming he was competent. He's leaving because of the undue pressure being put on him under this circumstance. And let me say this, and I'm saying it without the need. The only problem why the president has not been able to make this nomination is the fact that the politicking around the thing, the lobbying around the thing is just too much for the president.
Okay, let's see about
I'm being frank with you. Look,
why did we multiply the problem by dicing up the regions again?
Thank you. You see, let me tell you this. I'm giving information. In fact,
I'll give you 1 minute to give
in one
that
district in Ashanti region, the darling boy of somebody was not and the list of people who were shortlisted. But this was a person who was involved in Galamsey. And that person, let me say the big boy, the big party person, is a Galamsey baron. And he wants his guy to be the DCE. And because of the guy's earlier involvement in Galamsey, he's been cut out. He's not on the shortlist list. And he's insisting. So that appointment will not be made. If the appointment is made today,
whoever gets it will not be approved.
Will not be approved because he has control over the assembly. 2, he will definitely organize people to demonstrate against the appointment.
Wow. Interesting drama coming up. Ms. Magwe President, National Association of Local Authorities. They said I should ask you whether you are confident of being retained as DC for Goba West.
Well, let me say that I have been listed as unopposed. I mean, so
congratulations in advance.
But you have the mercy of the assembly members.
The power of the president. The president can take a decision, and the assembly members will have to do the necessary thing. But
how did they know?
I want to dissociate myself from Honorable Nilante's comments regarding the falsification of.
Ms. Mark, tilt your camera a bit for me so that I can see your face. You're hiding your face. Thank you.
To be able to achieve DDF, I want to really dissociate myself from that. In fact, there are several indicators, including the very things that he mentioned: IGF generation, relationship with other stakeholders, a lot of them. Maybe he has experienced that in his assembly. I don't know of it, and I don't know of any other one as well. But let me indicate that the proposal for the election of MMDCEs is something that NALAG really supported, and we campaigned in favor of it. What we realized is that over the period, the muscles of NDC as a political party, the New Patriotic Party as a political party, and some other smaller parties putting together their efforts are able to drive the numbers to get a lot of people participate in the democratic process. When you compare that with the participation in the local assembly level, you realize that because we have made it non-partisan by the constitution, the drive is actually not there. And when that is not there, it defeats the purpose of local government, because local government is actually for grassroots participation, for everybody to have a say. And I don't believe that when we want to have the election on partisan basis, we wouldn't have competent people to compete for the position. Godfred, I should think that I am competent enough. I should think that Honorable Nilante himself is competent enough. Look at the competent young men and women we have from both political divides. I cannot say that we could have had people better than Honorable Nilante's caliber to represent his people. Maybe if the other person had won, he would have also represented them very well. It doesn't mean that when elections are open to political parties, people with that technical knowledge, competence level will refuse to participate in. That is an argument I wouldn't want to buy. And look at, Honorable mentioned it, look at Sierra Leone. They came from a Tony war, came to copy from us ditto. And today, they are able to elect their mayors. I want to use mayor because internationally that is what people understand. They're able to elect their mayors on partisan basis. Today in Freetown, the government of Sierra Leone sits in Freetown, and Freetown is managed by a mayor from the opposition party, a very competent young lady for that matter. So I don't subscribe to that argument at all. We need to have a system that will allow majority of us to have a say in our governance system. If we still want to continue to operate it the way we have been doing, we'll go for election, and the District Assembly level will have 30% turnout, maximum 40% turnout. But when it is about the general election, where NDC is massing up, galvanizing people, MPP is doing the same, all other political parties are doing the same, we go for an election and sometimes we have 70%, 80% voter turnout. That is popular participation that we are all looking for. And so, and I also don't believe the NDC position was rather on the fact that they didn't want to make the assembly member election partisan, but in tentatively they did agree that chief executives could be elected on partisan basis. The fact that if we were able to amend that provision of the constitution, then we were going to elect MMDCs on partisan basis, and we're also going to elect assembly members on partisan basis. So this is it. The president has said it, not like we have made it known. We started our democratic dispensation way back. We have operated the 1992 constitution for some time now. If you look around us, Burkina Faso, you go to Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, not our peers, I would say our children, who mostly copied from our system, are far ahead of us. So we will recommend that NDC, MPP, especially the current nature of parliament, they should sit down, agree with the president that this is about time. In fact, I also don't believe that it was because of economic situations. It was just about the fact that one party decided not to go with it. Let me tell you, if NDC had agreed, galvanized their support base, MPP galvanized their support base, these two political parties alone would have given us the percentage that we were looking for. But because one of them decided, okay, we are not going to toe that line, whatever you do, you will go and you will never achieve the result. And so, yes, I still want to insist that the letter dated 11th of January 2021 has been misconstrued and misunderstood.
Okay.
And I see that as a basis for the whole Supreme Court action. And I am not an authority of the law. It is only the court that will decide. But my reading of the law, the technicalities and all that, if the letter that was written on 11 January is the basis of the court action, then the action is likely to fail. I will not say it is bound to fail. It is likely to fail. And again, I also want to indicate again that MMDCEs, their tenure is coterminous with, it's not coterminous with that of the president. Let's look at how, as a nation, as Franklin also said, we can push this agenda together, have our MMDCs elected, so that when a new president assumes office, or even the incumbent president assumes office, there wouldn't be that fear within the MMDCs, corners, whether I am being retained, I am not being retained, and all that. The fear that certain things can get party people agitated, and that can limit my chances of being retained. We can do away with all this when finally we are able to elect our Metropolitan Municipal Chief Executive. Dr. Richard Fiajo, I want to repeat that I have acted in law. And so if you put me before any court, I will use the Constitution, the Local Government Act, the Transition Act, and defend myself. Let's put our heads together and make local government better. I reckon people want their MMDCs so that they can approach them and all that. But listening to the communication director, I get the impression that it will not be long. If by next week we have the announcement made, within 14 days we're able to lobby our way out, why not? I, for example, will come and solicit the support of Honorable Nilanti to get his people in the assembly to aid me to get my confirmation. That is all that I will say.
All right, then, thank you very much. Let me take a couple of messages and then we can move on to our next topic. So good morning, Godfred. The reason why the president is delaying the nomination of MMDCs is that he wants to come out with a team of competent people to steer the affairs of the various MMDCEs. Let's be patient with him. This is Suleiman Damba, the Big Six Secretary in Tamale. Good morning to you guys in Tamale. Kweku from La Paz says, I support the elections of MMDCs, but I'm totally against partisan elections of MMDCs. I don't want an NPP, mosque, or NDC market in my area. Good morning, Mr. Boafo. This is coming from Mensa in Accra. It says, if Ghana is waiting for a non-political district assembly system, oh, sorry, I missed that message. It says, if Ghana is waiting for a non-political district assembly system, then we shall wait till thy kingdom come. What we should be talking about is efficiency and effectiveness. Even in Rwanda, district assemblies are political, but efficient and effective. It is the way Ghana has, it is just that Ghana has become overly political. Let's get the structures right and stop being overly partisan. That is what he says. Babamu from Tamale Central says, well, Babamu, you are talking about something we haven't yet started talking about, so just hold on a bit with that one. Jones Adoboy says, good morning, Godfred. I thought what was significant was that the opponent of MMDCs will make, well, Jones, your message is not very clear at the moment. Yeah, so I will end the messages here and take another break. When we return, we'll talk about the NDC and there are 34 recommendations for electoral reform in Ghana and what other parties, and by parties I don't mean just political parties, but other players in the election process in Ghana, what they have had to say about these proposals. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the big issue as we shift gears and talk about the NDC and their interest in electoral reform. In fact, the party has outlined a list of proposals that they think will help the democratic process of the country. And they put this out sometime this week. That was Nana Atuata, who's the chairman of the NDC Electoral Reforms Committee. It wasn't just him. I think this was a group that also had Professor Kwame Nahoa, if I'm not mistaken, working on. So they put together 34 recommendations and solicited all kinds of responses. But we'll just listen to a few things that Nana Atuata says, and then we'll come down and try and go through some of these proposals and the motivations or the justifications behind these proposals and how they fit into the current electoral process that we have. How does it improve it? There are those who have questioned even the motive of this call for electoral reform. We will go into all that when we return.
We propose to the NDC party that the Inter-Party Advisory Committee, that's the IPAC, should be backed by legislation. And the membership of the EC should be technocratic rather than political, with the membership positions being advertised, candidates interviewed, and the most suitable persons appointed. They indicate that there should be a criteria to sieve out registered but inactive and moribund political parties that do not appear to be serious from the electoral process from the membership of IPAC. They react that a proposed election adjudication committee should be given a time frame within which to finish their work. We're in an interesting development. I think at TUC or so, they took a snapshot of the recommendation and said the NDC should keep faith with Ghanaians and implement its reform proposals when it finds itself in government. And if the proposals have not been implemented at that time, they will bring that snapshot to show to Professor Kwame Nahoa. They also propose that the NDC may wish to secure the buy-in of other political parties before the proposals are tabled at a meeting of either the EC or the IPAC. But in all our consultation, one of the issues that came out stood out clearly to be used to undertake a dispassionate and open discussion and review of the EC's operations. They are aimed at contributing to a national conversation on electoral reforms against the background of critical and lingering cross-party dissatisfaction with the electoral process. I think General did indicate that all previous and even the current EC have been subject to intense attack from the political parties over their period. Is it that they are so bad or there's a problem with the system? Of course we must look at this kind of issue. We hope that the government will initiate the necessary steps to operationalize, especially the 3 flagship reform recommendations in Part A of our proposals, as well as the recommendations of the Constitutional Reform Commission. We also hope that you, the media, would disseminate these reform proposals captured in this booklet as widely as possible to enable as many of our countrymen and women to participate in the national conversation.
So that was Nanato Dazi, not Nanato Asa, Nanato Dazi, reading out the NDC's proposed electoral reform. So basically what has the background to this is that the NDC met CSOs, organized labor, other than the TUC. Then they met the TUC, they've met the diplomatic community, US Embassy, UK High Commission, Canadian High Commission. They met the EU delegation and member states. They've met Christian leaders and engaged the National House of Chiefs, as well as, well, they haven't yet met with the National House of Chiefs and the NDC Parliamentary Caucus, but they have 34 recommendations that they have segregated into parts A and B. Now, part A require action by the government and the legislature and other bodies other than the EC. So we'll break that conversation into that. And then part B contains reform proposals requiring action by the EC. And so we'll start with part A. Now part A will highlight 3, which the NDC says are their flagship proposals for electoral reform. Basically, the first one is that they are proposing that the members of the EC should be appointed by the President in consultation with the Council of State and with the prior approval of Parliament, provided that the chairperson shall be approved by 2/3 of all members of Parliament. Now, their justification is born out of how Supreme Court justices are appointed in this country, and they also note the recommendations of the Constitutional Review Commission, of which Mrs. Jean Mensah, the current EC, was a member of from December 2011 when they made a similar proposal. Then they also talk about the splitting up of the EC. That's point 2. But the second one is that IPAC be backed by legislation, and that its composition and functions should be clearly spelt out in the legislation. That IPAC should be backed by legislation. And then the third one is that the EC be split into 2 separate and distinct bodies. Very interesting, Franklin. It says the Office of the Regulator of Political Parties, responsible for the registration and regulation of political parties, and then an Electoral Commission responsible for the conduct of presidential, parliamentary, district assembly, and unit committee, and other public elections and referenda. So these are the top 3. Franklin, let me start from here. We'll be joined on this by Dr. Abdul Jalil Ateku, who is a political science lecturer at the University of Ghana, to have this conversation. But Franklin, your thoughts on this? There are those who question the motivations of the NDC for this sudden clamor well, sudden is, well, there are those who say it's a sudden need for change in the electoral process. If they had won the election, they would not have made these calls. But now they are saying we need electoral reform, and they've come up with 34. But let's deal with these three, the top three first. Your thoughts?
Well, it looks as if they will never continue to dial the intentions of political parties in this town, really, especially when they are in opposition. Don't forget the MPP also proposed a number of reforms, which has also led us to where we are today. So as for the cynicism, that will continue. But I think the engagement process was an excellent idea. I sent a representative to the meeting because I couldn't take part. And the feedback he brought was that it was a very well organized event and the recommendations were quite bold. I take the first one, for instance, which has to do with the appointment, or if you like, the appointment of the electoral commissioner, right? It's bold, but I think they could have even been bolder. They could have added that before the parliament votes to test majority vote, every person who believes is qualified for the job must submit his or her CV to a body that will vet the CVs. They'll vet them openly. It will be live on TV. And then after the vetting process, whoever comes tops, right, is then recommended for Parliament to decide to test majority. And eventually the president would then say, okay, you are properly affirmed. That's what Kenyans do in the case of the Chief Justice. And I watched it live on Kenyan TV last year.
It's a very, very strong.
Exactly. You remember the judiciary just dismissed the president's proposal. Yeah, that's exactly what you need. So I think that is a bold decision by the NDC. Proposal, by the NDC. But I'm adding a further layer to ensure that whoever wants to be, wherever is, as far as the person is Ghanaian and is qualified, should submit CVs to a vetting committee. As I don't have to repeat it, before the two-thirds majority thing kicks in. As for the conversations about the appointment of the other members of the commission, well, I suspect they should go through the same procedure, because in the absence of the substantive electoral commissioner, any of them could be chosen. You understand? So it's very important. That helps a lot, because then it builds a bulwark against criticisms, suspicions, and all of that. Look, the EC is so powerful that it's the only body that has never been audited for a very long time. You think if we had this process where the EC goes through this very critical and high-level, certification process, they can say no to the Auditor General. As you know, Domelevo was actually beginning to audit before his problem started, right? I think that is a very excellent idea, a proposal from the NDC, but I'm adding another layer to it. The issues around the legislation of IPAC. Well, I think that is coming up because somehow the EC can dismiss IPAC's decision, right? And we've seen it several times, not just under this particular EC, but the previous ones as well. They can say, well, what was agreed at IPAC was not necessarily binding. And indeed, those who constitute IPAC, if I had my way, the IPAC would only be constituted by people who have a proper following. Because I've seen IPAC decisions being superintended on the majority party like the NDC or MPP, because a number of persons who can't pull even 1,000 votes were supposed to be members of the IPAC. It's happened, right? And I think that, so I would think that the legislation should go a further step to say that parties with proper representation.
Well, there is a proposal like that. They are asking for a very rigid enforcement of the criteria for
because we don't want a situation that we have in Mali, where because the country is supposed to be, the electoral political party is supposed to be funded, everybody wakes up and sets up a political party, right? So maybe IPAC, maybe that's the spirit within which this was being propounded or proposed. The other one which I find interesting is the
Office of the Regulator of Political Parties.
Exactly, because the political parties, the EC, I think it was there's a CSO, I've forgotten the name, that went to court and got a ruling in their favor that the EC must actually regulate the political parties by asking them to present their audited accounts and all of that. It's never been happening. Because the EC itself has never been. Have you seen the EC being audited in the latest round of the Auditor General's report? It doesn't happen. So I think maybe that's the spirit with which this is being proposed, that the Electoral Commission should be diced up into two, where you have one party looking at just political party, and I suspect that would include their financials and the way they are organized. Then the other one, which will be in charge of just elections. I agree with that position as well.
Splitting it into two.
I think it makes sense. It doesn't need to. It doesn't mean that they have to be occupying different
buildings,
offices.
but
yeah, but then there must be
different units.
Two different units, and I think it's coming back. It's coming on the back of so many suspicions as well, right? I mean, the EC can just wake up and decide that, well, this is the way I'm going to organize this election. I'm going to regionally collate. The EC can wake up on 5th December and tell us that a group of people from SAR cannot vote in the parliamentary elections. It's absurd. I suspect this is a one giant step towards, limiting some of these very absurd decisions that come out from a very, should I say, overly centralized electoral commission. So I agree with that as well.
Okay.
There's one.
But what are the chances of the government or parliament taking this up, though? Because
well, as I understand,
the Part A are all things that are out of the hands of the EC. These are reforms that need to be taken up by either parliament or the executive.
Well, that's a conversation, and I think it needs to continue. I would have thought that if anybody was interested in these reforms, they shouldn't even wait for these recommendations to be made. Because as I understand, the NDC has made these recommendations, similar recommendations as far back as 2015, which were seen as, okay, we'll get it done, but never really got to see them be implemented. So maybe this is another but it's a good question you've asked. Maybe we should set up, I hate setting up bodies, but let's have a national consultative platform where we can have this conversation dispassionately. But anybody who has watched how the EC has been organized, not just around this time, that before under the NDC and now, I mean, clearly would be welcoming some of these recommendations, really.
All right, let me bring in Dr. Abdul Jalid Ateku, Political Science Lecturer at University of Ghana. Somebody I've only seen in my email, but I guess today we'll put a face to the name. Good morning, Dr. Ateku.
Yeah, good morning, Godfred. How are you doing?
I am doing well. It's a pleasure to finally see your face.
Okay.
But I guess the question from my side on this matter would be, the cynics would say, how dare the NDC come up with this? Those who monitor politics would say, these reforms make sense. Can we have a conversation about it?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning to your panelists and your viewers. I'm excited that this conversation has begun, particularly talking about, some of the proposals that the NDC has brought forth. I think that it is good, and we must commend the NDC for taking this step. If you recall, looking at where we are, from where we started from 1992, particularly after the Bosch election, 1992 election. In 1994, thereabout, that is where the issue about this IPAC came. And we realized that 1996 election, we've seen some tremendous improvements in how the elections were organized. And from those years until today, every election, we see some new things that are coming up, and particularly some of these have been the contribution of the political parties. If you look at the MPP, they have made a lot of contributions which help in shaping or influencing our elections. So listening to the NDC and a proposal that they have brought forward. In fact, if you look at the first one that you talked about, the
appointment of the EC.
The appointment of the EC. In fact, for me, I'm an apostle. I even will expect that we should move this conversation even beyond the Electoral Commission to the other constitutional bodies, SRAJ, and some other key positions in the police service like the IGP, the military. There are certain the Supreme Court and all that. I think that because if we look at our institutional arrangement, if we're talking about elections, okay, the NDC is talking about maybe the appointment of the commission members and all that, all because of the mistrust and the suspicion. And it is not the NDC. If you look at when the MPP, for example, was in opposition, we saw a number of this in asking for voters register. We have 80,000 Togolese on our voters register and all that. So there is a whole lot of suspicion, mistrust about the commission, and all also because of who appoints the members of the Electoral Commission. It is not the making of the president, but it is the Constitution. So while the Constitution empowers the president to appoint, he has no other decision than to do it. But the point is that when a president appoints and the same president is seeking election, which is going to be managed by the same people, all right? And if there is a dispute, this dispute will also be brought before a Supreme Court, where you may have maybe about 100%, 50%, 60% of them going to sit on the election petition. So I think that it is a very good thing, and I think that we need to even move the conversation even beyond only the Electoral Commission to the other constitutional bodies and other key positions in this country.
Interesting. What about the move to cement IPAC by giving it legal spine? We've seen a lot of, one would say, rancor with the IPAC system in the past 2 years, particularly because the NDC feels IPAC has been consistently disrespected. In the build-up to the 2020 election, this was a matter that was constantly on the table. IPAC being ignored by the EC, or NDC feeling that IPAC was not respecting its opinion.
Yeah, in fact, yeah. So for the IPAC, all right. So as it is now, it is not a constitutional creation, all right. Yeah. So from somewhere in March 1994 and all that. And if we look at the work that IPAC, the contribution of IPAC, political parties and other stakeholders, all right. So, but the point is that because it is the commission that has the mandate, they have a specific function to perform. The decisions of the IPAC are not binding, no matter how it is. So maybe at IPAC level, they may agree that we want to do A, B, and C, but the commission is not bound because it is not part of this thing. But they have, IPAC has made a lot. Electoral Commission, there are so many issues that through the IPAC, they've been able to bring some reforms and all that. So I think, and if you look at in some of the African countries, in West African countries, particularly in French West Africa, for example, you have the political parties' representation at the Electoral Commission. But in our case, that is not the situation. So if we have IPAC, I think now having seen our IPAC's work, okay, the work IPAC has done over the years from somewhere 1994 to this period, I think we can say that IPAC has done a lot. And once you have the NDC, the MPP, and other parties as critical stakeholders whose contributions are very key, I think if we go ahead to give it a legal backing, all right, and then with some, it means that the point is that if we are doing so, it means that there are certain functions that Electoral Commission is performing today will not be able to perform. But I think that it is a good thing. I think it is another good thing. I think that the conversation must continue. So because once we agree that looking at the period, they have done a lot, and I think that they still have, because they are critical. That's the only platform now where you have the Electoral Commission, you have the political parties all coming together to take a decision and all that. But the point is that it still remains that it has no legal backing. So once it is a good thing that they are doing, then I think that we have to do that. But we should also be careful about how, so that we do not take every certain key functions that the electoral commission will be performing to the IPAC. But I think that giving it a legal backing, I think I support that as well.
And finally, on the flagships, they talk about the split of the EC into two separate and distinct bodies. I think, frankly, we missed those ones. Separate and distinct bodies. So the first one is the Office of the Regulator of Political Parties, ORPP, responsible for the registration and regulation of political parties. And then the unit that is responsible for the conduct of elections and referenda.
Right. So at the moment, it is the electoral commission that has mandate or that perform the function. The electoral supposed to take so many things, to even visit political parties, take audit to know what they have and all that. Okay. It's part of the whole system of trying to check corruption and other things. But I think that for now, since 1993, the electoral commission has rather focused much more on the elections, neglecting the other functions. So it is a function, all right? So once it is by law, the electoral commission is supposed to do that. I think that for me, going to create another body, unless if there is any compelling reason why the electoral commission has not been able to satisfy or they have not been able to perform this particular critical function, then we will get to know why they've not been able to do that, and as to whether it is important, or is it a way of them maybe just that they do just focus on the election, leaving the other aspect. So for me, I think that we need to tread cautiously a bit to see why the electoral commission has not been able to perform this critical function as well. And whether it is, from now, I do not get any compelling reason why we should have another body, even though I do know that that function has not been performed well by the electoral commission, looking at their role in terms of the conduct of elections and then referenda.
Well, I'm looking at the master document here. This one is Professor Kwame Nahoy's own. And on that particular proposal, the background, according to the NDC, is that neither the Constitution nor the EC Act makes the EC responsible for the regulation of political parties. That function is prescribed by Act 574. Now, it says the two functions are separate, involving heavy responsibilities that require full-time attention. Now, on their justification, the NDC says that the separation will, one, enable the two offices to focus equal and full-time attention on their two different mandates. Two, mitigate the perception of bias on the part of the EC as a result of its current dual mandate. Three, address the concern expressed by the National Security Secretariat that mistrust of the EC is a potential ground for violence and a threat to state security. Four, ensure conformity with international best practice, as many countries have this system of separation. 5,
ensure that procurement is done prudently. That's my addition.
Doctor, I think we are...
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. So if it is just that, maybe if it is, the terms, there is no constitutional backing to it, and maybe it is just the Act 474, right?
574.
Is it not a matter of maybe hello?
Act 574, yes.
Yes. Okay, the political parties. So it is still within. There is still some kind of legal backing to it. So we need to know why the electoral commission has not been doing well. Is it that they are aware that in conducting elections and referenda, they are so overwhelmed with that they cannot add to this? If that is the case, that is why maybe we'll be saying that. But sometimes maybe they just decided that, it is about the elections. So let's get the elections. If it is a referendum or whatever, we organize it, and then to the neglect of the other side. So if it is just sheer that something that they can perform, we need to look at that before thinking about maybe bringing in another body.
Okay. Let me.
This is an important. It's an important area. The political parties, these are very, very good, but we need to have sufficient or compelling reasons why we will need another body to regulate that. So if it is that in terms of, I mean, you look at the constitution, maybe they do not have a specific reason in terms of regulating political parties, or even the act that established the electoral commission. It is not. So if that is the case, can we do that so that we hold the electoral commission to it for maybe not performing this critical function? So I think that we need to look into it deeply and then take a firm decision. So I'm still still not clear for me why we should have another body unless we have sufficient reasons to say that electoral commission cannot perform that because of maybe elections and all that. Then it is only then that maybe I think that I would say that then we must have another body.
Okay, that's interesting. I think Honorable Nilanti, I might just have Elvis as part of this conversation eventually. So I'm hoping to get confirmation of that. But on the first flagship, okay, I have Mr. Efrianka, so just wait for me 5 seconds. Mr. Efrianka, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
These are not projects, so when you say flagship.
Mr. Efrianka, please unmute your microphone for me. Mr. Efrianka.
Okay.
Yes,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for making the time for us. I will make this rather quick. Let's start with the spirit behind these 34 reforms.
Okay.
There are a lot of cynics. There are a lot of political cynics who say you wouldn't have pushed these reforms if you had won the election. These are reforms born out of your frustrations with your loss in the last election.
Good morning to my brother, the indefatigable Okunka of Odododio forever. Anyway, I think it's important to look at the context within which these reforms came out. You know that in 1992, after the elections, the MPP boycotted the parliamentary elections because they were dissatisfied with the process. And out of that, it was felt that there was a need for a platform to create an avenue for the opposition party, as well as CSOs and other stakeholders to have an input into the electoral architecture. So that is how IPAC was born. And through the instrumentality of IPAC, we've had a lot of very positive reforms in our electoral system. For example, we moved from opaque ballot boxes to transparent ballot boxes, from thumbprint photo ID cards to photo ID cards, the counting of votes and declaration of same at the polling station, the biometric register, etc. So there's been a lot of positive reforms that have occurred within the IPAC. Now, after every election, we look at the electoral system and see how we can best improve upon it. So, for example, in 2013, after the election petition, when the court gave its ruling, the court directed that the EC must undertake some reforms in order to improve upon the electoral system. And so this is the background. And indeed, the EC put together a committee made up of various stakeholders. MPP were represented. This is the document, that talks about the EC's Committee for Electoral Reforms. And various stakeholders made an input. Sidun Ketia, Kwabena Japan for MPP, Kwabena Donfe for CPP, and Nin Kofiado for YPP, Dr. Jampo Kwesijona, Dr. Franklin Odro from CDD. So out of this came about 14 different reforms. These reforms were then inherited by Madame Charlotte Osei, but she was confronted with an election immediately, therefore she couldn't do much about the reforms. So Madame J. Mensah inherited the reforms. Now, what we have observed in the past at IPAC is that decisions at IPAC are no longer taken seriously by the EC. The posturing of the EC has been that, well, they are backed by law and they can do whatever they want. If you are backed by law and you can do whatever you want, then why do you need an IPAC? And in any case, there's a contradiction because the EC itself then appointed an eminent advisory committee. So it's an inherent recognition that even though the EC is independent, it requires the inputs of external people, stakeholders, in order to enrich its work. So we took a step back and said, look, the IPAC that we knew is no longer the IPAC that we have today. So let's take a step back. Let's look at the entire architecture of our electoral system. Yes, the 2020 elections were critical parts. So many things went wrong. And we went beyond the 2020 elections and said, well, how can we improve upon the entire electoral system? And that's why we appointed technocrats to lead the process. So the NDC, as a political party, for example, presented its proposals to this committee. And the committee looked at existing reports of the EC's Electoral Reforms Committee, the 2015 Reforms Committee that I talked about. They looked at international and domestic literature on electoral reforms. They looked at international best practices on electoral systems. They conducted interviews with some former top management staff of the EC. They examined the position papers of the party's own directorate, as I said. The committee also had access to some important pertinent documentation from the EC. And so out of this came these 34 proposals. And embedded in these 34 include the initial 14 proposals that the EC couldn't implement over the years. So they could implement only about 2 or so. And then subsequent to that, we've met with CSOs, we've met with organized labor, those who are outside TUC, we've met with the TUC, we've met with the US Embassy, UK High Commission, Canadian High Commission, we've met with the EU delegation and member states, we've met Christian leaders, we've met National Peace Council, we've met Muslim leaders, we've met various small groups, and they are all making inputs. And so it's refreshing to see that indeed this matter is being discussed. That is why we call them reform proposals. The rationale is that these proposals are meant to enrich and enhance our electoral system and improve upon the electoral architecture. So they must be looked at on its merits. I've heard people say it's coming from the NDC. Of course, it must come from the NDC. The NDC is a major stakeholder in the politics of this country. We have 137 seats. The MPP has 137 seats. When the MPP were in opposition, in 1992, they boycotted Parliament and they called for reform. In fact, most of the reforms at that time were proposed by the MPP. The NDC was in power then. Our posturing was that, look, insofar as the reforms they are proposing will enhance the credibility of the electoral system and enhance and improve upon transparency, we should go along with it. And so that is the spirit with which we should look at these issues. We should discuss them dispassionately, look at the issues on its merits. Those that we can accept wholeheartedly, we look at it. Those that we can accept with some modifications, we look at it. Those where we can push to medium term, we look at it. So it's meant to be a very open, frank, sincere, discussion that would bring more inputs from the general public and all stakeholders, so that together we can improve upon our democratic ethos.
Considering you say reforms and discussions, and you've given us a good background to how the electoral process in Ghana has been shaped by proposals from the MPP and also from the NDC in times gone past. But considering the current poor relationship your party enjoys with the EC, part one of your reforms are reforms that require, some of the reforms are reforms that require the EC to act by itself as an institution. How do you rebuild the bridges that have been burnt prior to the 2020 election to at least get some of these reforms onto the table officially?
We've written to the EC officially, and they have responded officially. They responded, I can send it to your producer. They've responded that they've received our reform proposal and it's being looked at. That is official response written. Number two, the Electoral Commission is an institution that is meant to serve the Ghanaian populace. It's not an independent entity that will do whatever it wants. So in good management practices dictates that it should stakeholder inputs should be a critical part of its management style and strategy. And if it's not doing so, it's incumbent upon us to put the necessary pressure together with civil society, media, and everybody to get them to act right. So we cannot be in a country where the Electoral Commission has been set up to ensure their first customers are the political parties. In fact, they are first and last. They are the political parties. And they are paid by the taxpayers. So they are supposed to serve the interest of the political parties. And we may disagree with them. And indeed, this is not the first EC that a political party has disagreed with. In any case, they did the MPP boycott to the 1992 elections. But that Electoral Commission is recognizing the critical need for stakeholder input and recognizing that in order to enhance its own credibility and to build confidence in the systems and institutions, opened up and allowed for engagement and allowed for inputs to come. So if the NDC has brought proposals, I think the logical thing to do is to look at the proposals on its merits, and then we'll look at it, discuss it, and then we'll move it forward. Those that we accept, and like I said, those that we accept with modifications, those that we put on the back burner, we'll all discuss as we are doing, we'll make inputs. But we should not create the impression, and you see, it's a subconscious thing, sometimes even media in your questioning, you make it look as if the EC is some monolithic entity up there that will do whatever it wants, regardless of its implications and ramifications on the entire political system. And I think that's completely unacceptable. We need to start from the premise that as major stakeholders, our inputs matter, the inputs of all other stakeholders matter, and we should jaw and discuss and rationalize and look at the issues on its merit, and then look at what will improve upon the system. Never should it be that a state entity would see itself or be positioned in such a manner that they will do whatever they want, regardless, because there could be also very negative consequences and repercussions for the entire country. Don't forget that the National Security Report that came out recently declared that the Electoral Commission is one of the institutions that lacks credibility and people do not have confidence in them, and it poses a security threat. So, in fact, by proposing these reforms and by engaging other stakeholders, and if the EC also opens up and we all discuss, it will rather enhance its credibility. But if it persists in saying, well, we will do whatever we want, then it's going to be a national security danger, and that's not where we want this country to be.
We've already discussed quite extensively the three flagship reforms you propose. So let me just go to part B, which contains the 24 highlighted by the lead 9. And so we'll take the 9. But I noticed one thing before we even get to that. How is it that the very significant matter that has engaged public discourse, at least in my estimation, is the monetization, the increasing monetization of electoral politics in Ghana, and then the cap on political party funding? However, I see that it has rather been shelved to hand other issues that were raised that will be discussed as supplementary reform proposals. I thought this would rather make page 1.
Well, the point is that we are humble and modest enough to acknowledge that we don't have all the knowledge and wisdom in this country or in the world. And that is why after we put these proposals together, we engage various stakeholders and received feedback from them. So you will recognize that at the back of our press statement, we have listed the various proposals and feedback from various entities. And the fact that we've taken them on board means that we recognize them as positive inputs. In any case, I don't see there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a document, engaging stakeholders, and then based on the feedback, doing an addendum. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It would have been a challenge if we said, well, irrespective of the feedback we are getting, our position remains sacrosanct. So we are flexible enough and open-minded enough, and recognizing that is a very important aspect. Having said that, however, embedded in our proposal for the separation between the EC's activities of supervising elections and the management of political parties, when we had the discussions, of course, we cannot bring all the papers, the background papers on the discussions, but that was a major factor. We felt that very soon we should be moving towards having that conversation, because for some of us, we think that part of the major problems this country has to do with the financing of political parties. And the Honorable is sitting there, he will tell you what it takes for them to even go through primaries, let alone talk about the main elections. And it's a major source of worry and a drain on our national coffers. But if you don't fund the political parties, how can you regulate them? So funding of political parties is embedded in that, but you can only regulate parties that you fund. In all other countries where the state funds the political parties, it is when you fund that you have the audacity to put in place mechanisms and measures to streamline their activities. And so it is there, and it is something that we're going to look at, because we believe that ultimately we have to start looking at that, because indeed it takes so much out of our coffers, our GDP. Every year, I was telling somebody that every 4 years, if you look at the amount of money we put into elections, both parties, especially the incumbent parties, it's a huge dent on our GDP. And we embrace this democracy without looking at the sources of funding. People will talk about democracy is expensive. Yes, it's expensive, but if you look at all these other countries, the United States, UK, etc., they have strong economies to back them. The US has the military-industrial complex. They have the whole Silicon Valley. I mean, one industry alone can decide finance political parties, and it will not be a dent in their overall budget. But here, every 4 years, we spend so much money on elections, and we thought that if we could do something about that, it would be useful. So embedded in that proposal, and I heard the panelist saying that he felt if there was no compelling need. Well, from our perspective, I respect his views, but our perspective is that a compelling need will be that when you eventually begin to fund political parties, you need an entity that will be able to, first of all, determine which political parties qualify for that kind of funding. So you must have a regulator that will be independent from the entity that supervises the elections itself, so that regulator will be able to regulate political parties that qualify to be political parties. And there could be various tiers of political parties. We don't have problems with small parties, but we're saying that there should be a certain logic, for instance, in IPAC representation at meetings, so that we've had two committees at IPAC, a legal committee and a technical committee. On these committees, MPP has one representation, NDC has one representation, and then the other parties, sometimes they have one, they have two. There's a certain logic in that. And if you look at even the composition of the Electoral Reform Committee of 2015, you will see that the NDC had one representation, MPP one, and then the smaller parties had two representatives. There's a certain logic. After all, the other parties could have said, well, we are 15, we are 20, we are 30. Each one of us should be represented. That would have been an unwieldy committee. So by that same logic, you needed to have a way. And that is why we are calling for the legislation for IPAC. Okay, so parties that have a place in parliament, what would be their representation? Parties that do not have a place in parliament, what would be their representation? What are some issues that are no-go area for the IPAC? What are issues that the IPAC can make inputs? Let me just give you an example, practical. Okay. In the past, before any CI goes to parliament, there's a committee at IPAC, that is a legal committee. They look at the drafts. So we all discuss and make inputs, and then they bring us a draft, which is discussed and accepted by IPAC. Then eventually it goes to parliament for parliament to work on. Over the past election, we never had any such thing. No draft came to IPAC, and Honorable Nilante will tell you when the final document went to the EC, there were so many mistakes to the extent that it even affected the timing for the laying of the CI to mature. There's so many issues. So we can all have a very honest, dispassionate discussion and look at some of these proposals and how we'll be able to implement them. The devil will be in the details.
Okay, let me now come to the lead 9, and I'll go through them, and then I'll go through all of them first, and then we can just pick on a few. So you talk about the continuous registration of voter system already approved by IPAC and accepted by the EC must be implemented. The continuous registration of voter system already approved by IPAC and accepted by the EC must be implemented. However, for reasons of cost and convenience, the registration should be undertaken at the district offices of the EC once a month on the last Friday of every month. Then you say the mandatory requirement for the publication of applicants for recruitment as temporary EC staff for registration of voters and for elections, and for allowing the public to object to applicants who have questionable backgrounds or have overt partisan biases must be strictly complied with. The EC should make sure that recruitment for the various categories of election officials is made as non-partisan as possible, with the available positions being advertised and non-partisan and competent persons being selected after interviews, that the list of all polling stations to be used for an election with their names, code, numbers, and locations should be published in the Gazette and as supplements in the state-owned newspaper not later than 30 days to the election. Regional collating centers should be abolished. The voting period of 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. should be maintained. The EC should establish election adjudication committees at the national and constituency levels as administrative dispute resolution mechanisms for first instance grievances against decisions and actions of election officials. And then the EC should be required to publish details of all election results on polling station by polling station and constituency by constituency basis on this website and in the Gazette. When you put these 9 together, what is the overall effect on our election process once they come into force? Okay, how does it significantly change what we do now?
Okay, so with the registration of voters, we know that every 4 years, 2 years, whatever, 7 years, we go through a lot of stress as a country. We spend so much money in registration, and the last registration, somebody even lost his life, and many people are maimed and injured, a lot of inconvenience, and we feel that we must just have this continuous process of registration. It makes things very simple. I think it's self-explanatory, so that we won't go into all these, people are moving people, busing people, people are being beaten, ministers are firing guns, there's bloodshed. I mean, after how many years of democracy, this is not where we should be. So I think we should be able to make progress. Perhaps we could look at maybe every 10 years, for example, maybe after a population census, then we could open the register and do a mass. But this every election, every 2 years, is becoming a challenge. Now,
well, we seem to have lost the sound of Mr. Efri Ankra.
The law requires that the names of such persons should be published. In the past election, we didn't have such a situation. And so it's important that we have people who are credible, who are not active party people, to man the polling stations. You all saw what happened in Techiman, for example, where the returning officer had the results declaration form, and you saw Colonel Bavru later retired, and a team, they went to him, give us a copy of the results, which is mandatory, and he refused. He refused. He just refused. So it's important that the backgrounds are there, publish them in the newspapers, and then everybody will know the list of all polling stations, code names, etc. These are all requirements that are there in the CI. But for this particular election, we recall that they shifted the dates back several times. So we, for instance, were asked to present our CD-ROM for the register. We went, they gave us one, later on they recalled it because they said there were errors on it, and then it took a long time less than 14 days before we got our voters register. But I want to focus on quite a number here. One, the regional coalition centers.
Yes.
They should be abolished.
Why?
The Americans are saying that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've been having elections. We've had 7 elections so far. And for the presidential elections, the electoral commissioner is the sole returning officer for the presidential elections. That is why for the presidential election, the results are not declared at the constituencies. So all the results are sent to the EC headquarters, and then they do the arithmetic. By that time, the polling agents or the agents of the various political parties in the strong rooms would have also had copies of their constituency results. And then they will then cross-check. When the EC chairperson certified, then it is released and announced. That has been the process that has worked. Come 2020, they introduced regional coalition centers. In the first place, if you look at the CI, it talks about regional coalition officer. For the constituency coalition centers or for the constituency elections, there's a system and there's an architecture that allows everybody to be part of that coalition before the certified results are given out and announced. But for this one, there is no system, proper system at the regional coalition centers. Well, for the regional, there are not even centers for a regional coalition officer who is supposed to put together all the results from the constituencies and then send them to the EC headquarters. So there are even legal questions, because if the EC is the returning officer, the sole returning officer for the presidential, where then comes in a regional coalition officers? Are they regional returning officers? The law doesn't make provision for that. And we have documentary evidence to show. We all know what happened in it happened in Greater Accra, it happened also in Eastern region, and the European Union reports, the Observer Mission report, states clearly that the regional coalition centers, the way they were handled was opaque, it was non-transparent, and we've had reports of figures being changed. In fact, today, when we finish, just go to the EC's website, if you can still find the data there, and put together all the constituency results from all the 275 constituencies, and then put together all the 16 regional summaries. You see that there's a difference in the results. And so it's created too many problems. I would think that it should be abolished. Again, the voting period of 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. should be maintained. We've had several elections, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. We've never had any issues. The argument has been that you want to finish voting early so that the counting and collation doesn't go into the night. But the reality is that after the constituency, the polling station declarations, when it goes to the constituency collation center, it takes between 5 to 7 hours for the collation to be done. And so if it's going to be done for 5 to 7 hours, minimum, let me stress, minimum, willy-nilly, you'll be operating in the night. So this whole business about you don't want to work in the night is totally untenable, because you definitely be working in the night. So the solution is to put in place proper lighting system. It doesn't cost too much. Ghana as a country, 275 coalition systems, we cannot provide adequate lighting. I mean, that's because you see, the primary duty of the Electoral Commission is to facilitate and make it easy for people to vote, put in place mechanisms, systems, and processes to make it easy, to facilitate people's ability to vote, cast their vote. Now, this 7 to 3 p.m. will create problems, especially for our farmers and fishermen in the rural areas. Most of them, if you've ever lived in a rural area, they would like to go to their farms or go and fish in the morning, come back, they are subsistent farmers and fisher folk, come back and find something to eat, and then they'll go and vote. If you close at 3, you put them in a rush, and most of these people in the rural areas will find it very, very difficult. Again, this same idea, I'm sure the people who put it out live in Accra. If you live in Accra, Roman Ridge, Airport, Kokomemle, you can just go to your polling station. But we have a former deputy minister of local government there, and he will tell you this country, if you really know this country, the hinterland and the interior of this country, Afram Plains and all those people, Dija Island, people have to cross rivers, people have to sit on tractors, people have to sit on canoes before they come to their polling stations to vote. You don't create a situation where by 3 o'clock you have many people who haven't cast their vote. In any case, what is the problem that we've been trying to solve? Let's maintain the 7 to 5. And then the EC should establish election adjudication committees at the national and constituency levels as administrative dispute resolution mechanisms for first instance grievances against decisions and actions of election officials. Typical case study, if you recall, Senate West.
Yes.
After the elections, there was a dispute. And what was the dispute? There was just about one polling station that needed to be recounted. The EC official refused. Eventually and ultimately, we had to go to court, go through all this long process. And what did the judge do? He directed, go and count that polling station. And we counted it. And of course, the NDC maintained the seat. So in such a matter, we shouldn't have gone to court. If we had this EAC, then there will be a system and a process where these issues could be resolved ab initio before it degenerates into court. Again, in this particular election, we had a lot of issues. I recall in my office, Honorable Marita Brew, Mr. Tony Luther, and a host of lawyers, they did a draft, and then we sent it to the EC. But what people do not know is that the Peace Council had met with us earlier, and we had raised issues about the results, the results that were coming in. And the Peace Council was going to facilitate a meeting between us and the EC. In fact, that was the basis on which the EC then informed Mr. Rojo Metonunu and Dr. Kwesa White to go and inform President Mahama that indeed there was going to be a meeting between the Peace Council and the EC to look at the NDC's complaints. And then when they left, she then declared the results. So if you had such a system, at first instance, all these reviews, all these issues could have been looked at. It happened before in 2008. The MPP had issues with the results, and they brought them before Dr. Farijan. Dr. Farijan looked at them. He was going to declare the results. He stayed the declaration of the results, looked at the MPP's issues, and it was on that basis that he said, okay, then let's go to time. And went to time, and everybody knows what happened. So these are things that we think that before we go to court, we should, as a first instance, have this EACs that will look at them. Then
hold on. Honorable Afrianga, just hold on for me. Let me take a quick break and come back, and then we can wrap this up. The Big should be right back. You're welcome back. We are in the final phase of this, but we are just trying to go through the NDC's 34 proposals, and we are doing this with the man who runs elections for the NDC, Elvis Afrianga. So, Elvis, let's wrap up on the part B, and then we will put everything together. So you still have the EC should be required to publish details of election results on polling station by polling station and constituency by constituency basis on this website and in the Gazette.
Yeah.
The EC does that, does it not? Why do you need it as part of reforms?
It does with the parliamentary. Indeed, there's a Supreme Court decision in 2004. Rojo Metonunu and the late squadron leader took the EC to court, asking them to publish the details of the polling station results on their website. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was untenable. And so we think that there has to be legislation to that effect, because we are talking about transparency. So the EC can decide to publish it at one time and decide not to publish it at another time. There's no law that holds them. I would think that for purposes of openness and transparency, if the polling station results are declared publicly at the polling station, we're in a modern era of communications. You should just put it on your website. And it must not be at the whims and caprices of the EC. Because what we've experienced is that sometimes, even for constituency results, sometimes you go to the EC website, it's there, another time it's been pulled down, another time is there something else. So there has to be clarity. But a very important point, which is not in the part A, which is not in the part B, but in part A, that we need to stress on, is the fact that we're asking that the EC must be a compellable witness in all parliamentary and presidential election petitions. We believe that it's important because the EC is the referee, and they must be held to account for whatever they do. Indeed, you all saw what happened at the Supreme Court. I was there throughout, and I recall that when we were trying to serve interrogatories on the EC, and also asking for inspection of documents, all the justices consistently, it took about 3 days, they kept saying, why don't you wait? When it's time for cross-examination, you'll be able to ask all those questions. They said it consistently. And so we were very surprised when it got to cross-examination, and then they now said, oh, she cannot be cross-examined. And they used civil procedural rules. You know, that was, in my view, a very unfair interpretation and application of the law. It was a literal interpretation of the law that was done in a manner to protect the electoral commissioner. And I don't think it's fair to us as Ghanaians, and even to her, because there are people who still have many questions about the elections. If you had had the opportunity of coming on the witness stand and the documents we asked for, you declared results several times and made mistakes. What was the basis of those results? What document did you stand on to declare those results? Let's all see it, okay? What are the documents that you use for your collation? Let's see it. And all these things did not happen. And we feel that it's a travesty of justice. And therefore, going forward, there must be legislation that will compel the EC as a compulsory witness when it comes to such issues, so that you produce the necessary documentation and give account of her or his or her stewardship.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me just come to Abdul Jalilu Atiku, Doctor, Political Science Lecturer, University of Ghana. So, quickly, Dr. Atiku, I'm sure you've heard Mr. Ovuzefrianka explain the motivations and also break down some of the reforms and the impact it will have. Please unmute your microphone, sir.
Right, thank you very much, Godfred. Elvis brought some clarity to some of the issues, and he raised a number of others as well. And I think that, and you also talk about the monetization of the elections. In fact, it is an important, it's something we need to look at. And not even the political parties, even the amount of the money we spend on our elections. For me, I think that sometimes, even though we said that democracy is expensive, but that doesn't mean that we should spend on unnecessarily. Look at the voters register. In 2012, we had a biometric voters register. Then within a short time, 2020, we have to compile another voters register. We do not know what is going to happen. The point is, look at what we spent on the voters register in 2012 and 2020. If you've participated in election, for example, in the UK, okay, you look at things, you enter into a polling center, and you have only a black and white ballot paper and a pencil. You only use pencil. But here, we use the colored ballot paper, thumbprint, and everything. We have political parties right there, agents right there, and yet we are still suspicious. So we have to spend on elections. So I think that we need to look at the things that we spend our money on in elections. Yes, democracy is expensive, but it doesn't mean that we should spend unnecessarily. And the political parties too. So there is no form of regulation. So people spend. And that is also one of the reasons why sometimes you may not get the best in parliament, because it is not about people who are competent enough to represent us, but it is about the ability of someone to pay and get elected to represent his party and then to come into parliament. So I think that we need to look at that. And about closing time, 7 to 5, I think that we need to also look at things critically before we think about changing, okay? For now, I think that the 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. should still be maintained, even though so that the electoral commission should work towards that, right? if you look at if you are very conversant with our electoral, I mean the polling, some of the polling station areas, okay, you realize that it's very difficult to even get the electoral record forms and all that, pin sheets to the collation centers and all that. And if you recall, Electoral Commission 2020 promised to declare the results, is it 24 hours or so, 72 hours, right? And in order for them to achieve that or whatever, eventually we saw the figures they were giving us, okay? So we need to look at, I think that we should still maintain this, even though in this particular election, 2020 election, you realize that at certain points, you realize that most of the queues were not there. People had already come to vote. It's very good thing. So we should not just look at that and then just rush. I think that we should tread cautiously, look at some other decisions. So if we have maybe 2 other elections and then we are able to improve, then we can talk about maybe moving it from 5 to about 3 p.m. or so. Yes, and that is it. So, and then the polling station, particularly, okay, he also talked about the regional collation centers and all that. I think for me, the most important thing is the polling station and then the collation center at the constituency. So I do not see anything if we should have a regional collation center like we had. I don't. If they're asking for it to be abolished, I think that I don't see it as anything. It can be abolished. But the last thing I want to talk about is that, particularly the first issue I talked about the electoral commission, the appointment of the members of the electoral commission. The NDC is proposing that maybe there should be some kind of parliamentary approval or something. I think that we should rather be thinking about getting an independent body, okay, composed of representation of various identifiable groups, labor, political parties, civil society organizations, and some eminent person, maybe a former chief justice or former. So we should have an independent body. For me, still having, because if you go to look at our parliament right now, it's the same NDC and MPP and the politics and whatever they do over there. We saw the election of the speaker, all right? So we are taking the same electoral commission to the same parliament before. So if at a certain point in time you have a political party that is dominated by one party, okay, so it means that still it's going to be the same thing. So I think that we should rather be thinking about an independent body made up of various people from various groups and all that. I think that we should be thinking towards that. But I think I am for the fact that the appointment of the electoral commission and other constitutional bodies by the president, for me, I think that we need to look at that. It is not good.
All right, thank you.
It also feeds into the suspicion and then the mistrust that we have about the Electoral Commission and whatever they do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Jalil Atiku. I look forward to us engaging on another platform later on. And thank you very much to Mr. Elvis Afriankra for making time for us this afternoon. He's the Director of Elections of the NDC. And Franklin, thank you very much as well. I've run out of time. I'll give you a few seconds. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Big Issue. My name is Godfred Akotobuaf. We'll be back next week. Have a good weekend.